They are called rules, but they are laws as much as any other law. When the U.S. Constitution was adopted in 1787, the idea was that Congress would create the country's laws, or at least have the power to create all of the laws. The President has a chance to veto or sign the laws, but Congress has a way to override any veto, and the courts have judicial precedent, but Congress can override precedent, so it's really Congress that can create all of the laws. However, over the centuries, more and more authority to create laws has passed to the executive branch through the creation of administrative agencies. There have been a couple of reasons suggested for this. One reason is that Congress cannot regulate fast enough for a world that moves faster and faster. Another reason is that it is more efficient for agencies to enforce the rules they make themselves. The reasons are related, and maybe a little of both is true. A third reason might also be that Congress needs to be led more than it can lead. From the start, there were questions about whether or not administrative agencies were constitutional, and even if they were constitutional, were they a good idea? Certainly, giving more and more power to the executive branch skews the checks and balances that were designed to protect freedom. However, the courts eventually decided to allow administrative agencies with the theory that the agencies were acting with permission from Congress, and Congress could withdraw the permission at any time. The courts were often asked in specific cases whether the agency design was constitutional, and the courts eventually said, and this is including the United States Supreme Court, yes, because the agency served an important function, because Congress oversaw the agencies with considerable diligence, because the laws creating the agencies were very detailed. In other words, the laws that created the agencies specified what the agencies were supposed to do and specified what they were not supposed to do. And finally, because Congress could abolish agencies at any time. Federal regulations began in the 1800s, especially the very late 1800s, when various industries such as railroad, coal, beef, oil, and electricity came into being. And as discussed in another video, aviation regulation began in earnest in the 1920s. But much of today's system of agencies came into being in the 1930s during the Great Depression. At that time, regulation was seen as necessary to grow and stabilize the economy. The Commerce Clause of the Constitution was used considerably to justify the growth of alphabet agencies such as the FDA, the CCC, the FCC, the SSA, and the TVA, and much, much more. There arose a need to standardize the method for creating and enforcing laws created by the agencies, so over the course of decades there developed a general procedure for agencies to make laws and enforce laws. Enforcement will be discussed a lot more in later videos this semester, so this video is about rulemaking. Making laws by executive agencies usually requires the proposed laws to be published in the Federal Register for everyone to read, if they want to read the Federal Register, and then concerned citizens or businesses are allowed to make comments to the agency that proposed the law. Once time has been allowed for comments, the agency can proceed to make the proposed law official. Once the rule is official, it is published in the Code of Federal Regulations. So you should remember, publication in the Federal Register comes first, before publication in the Federal Regulations. If it helps remember, Register comes before Regulations alphabetically also. And, if it helps remember, Code is usually where the law is published, not where suggestions are published. Agencies have new ideas for laws every day, so the Federal Register comes out every day just like a newspaper. Of course, this is all online also. The website for all federal regulations is www.regulations.gov, which is searchable by word or phrase. But also the FAA publishes its own proposed rules on its own website, which is www.faa.gov, and which has a great deal of other information available. If you hear about a rule that has been proposed, and if you want to make a comment about it, you should go to www.faa.gov and click on FAA Regulations and Policies, and then click on Rulemaking, and then click on Recently Published Rulemaking Documents. Once you have found the proposed rule that you are interested in, you can find instructions on how to send comments to the FAA. Let's take a proposed rule to illustrate the process. On December 20, 2019, the FAA proposed a rule that would require the remote identification of unmanned aircraft systems. In other words, the FAA wanted all drones, with a few exceptions, to transmit an identification number and location continually during flight to a company that would store the data. Notice of the proposed law was printed in the Federal Register and posted to the websites on December 31, 2019, and comments were allowed from December 31 until March 2nd. In addition to the precise wording of the law, the notice tried to justify the law. The proposed law takes 10 pages of the notice, but the rest of the notice is 77 pages and includes a 12-page summary, a description of the need, a plan for phasing in the new law, and an explanation on how to make comments. It's a little ironic that the summary is actually longer than the proposed rule. The FAA received over 53,000 comments. As of June 13, 2020, the FAA has not made the drone rule a law, but they probably will. In other situations, obviously, the rule proceeds to become law. In those situations, the final rule is published with an explanation to the Federal Register, and, more importantly, it goes to the Code of Federal Regulations, where it will stay until amended or repealed. Sometimes the National Transportation Safety Board will suggest that the FAA adopt a new law, and the FAA will refuse to do so, although it might accept the recommendation. All of the NTSB's safety recommendations can be found on the NTSB's website, and they cover all conceivable modes of transportation going back to 1967. Here's an example which the NTSB numbered A-11-024. On July 31, 2008, a plane crashed in Minnesota, killing 2 pilots and 6 passengers. The NTSB determined that the probable cause of the crash was the captain's decision to attempt to go around late in the landing roll with insufficient runway remaining. The NTSB determined a contributing cause was co-pilot fatigue related to untreated insomnia. The co-pilot had been wanting to take a sleep aid called Zolpidem, but it appears he did not take it the night before his flight because FAA regulations prohibited flight within 24 hours of taking Zolpidem. On March 29, 2011, 2.5 years after the crash, the NTSB recommended that the FAA revise regulations and policies to permit appropriate use of prescription medication. It appears the NTSB thought the Zolpidem would have helped the co-pilot sleep the night before, so he would have been alert during the flight. The FAA took the recommendation under advisement, but 2 years later, so now we're into 2013, the FAA said no and explained that regulations regarding use of prescription medication were already flexible and complicated enough. Over the following 3 years, the FAA and NTSB exchanged messages defending the recommendations and decisions. Eventually, the NTSB closed its recommendation with the note, "Unacceptable action." All of the messages, arguing, is another way to put it, back and forth can be viewed on the NTSB website. All rules put out by the FAA, not orders or advisories or anything else, are in the Code of Federal Regulations, which is broken into 50 titles covering everything from accounts to wildlife. Orders, advisories, and other things might be printed in the Federal Register, but not in the Code of Federal Regulations. Title 1, for example, of the Code of Federal Regulations is for general provisions. Title 2 is for grants and agreements, and so on to Title 50 for wildlife and fisheries. Title 14 of the CFR is for aviation and is usually referred to as FAR, but that is officially discouraged now because FAR is supposed to refer to the Federal Acquisition Regulations. Title 14 for aviation is broken up into chapters and parts. There are over 1,300 parts. For example, Part 139 is devoted to airport certification, and Part 136 is devoted to commercial tours and national park tours by aircraft. When writing about the Code of Federal Regulations, the best format is usually the title number, then CFR, and then the section or part or chapter, as the case may be, such as 14 CFR Part 135 or 14 CFR Section 61.1. One last example, and then we'll be done. 14 CFR Part 61 concerning certification of pilots, flight instructors, and ground instructors is a good example. Most publications will show the history of a part or section, so if you look below on your copy of 14 CFR Section 61.1, you might see something like 62 FR 16298, which is a reference to the Federal Register. The number 62 refers to the volume of this Federal Register, which was published, by the way, in 1997, and the number 16298 refers to the page. If it is not below the section 61.1, it might be at the end of the part in your copy. And you might also see a docket number, 25910, but that's not so important. Section 61 specifically has been amended 7 times since 1997, and the volume and page number for each amendment will probably also show in the footnote at the bottom of 61.1. But just talking about the part 61, if you go online and look up 62 FR 16298, you will find where most of the current version of Part 61 was adopted by the FAA in 1997. And actually, you should start reading at page 16,220, which, among other things, says the rule changes were first published in the Federal Register in 1995 at 60 FR 41160. Between those two publications in the Federal Register, that's between 62 FR 16220 and 60 FR 41160, you can discern the complete history of the rule changes for Part 61 in 1997. The changes were about 10 years in the making. A number of organizations had suggested changes, and technology had made advancements, and some provisions in Part 61 just did not seem fair or efficient since the mid-1980s. The FAA actually held open public meetings in 1989 on the topic. Then on August 11, 1995, the FAA published notice in the Federal Register of proposed changes to Parts 1, 61, 141, and 143, but mainly Part 61. In fact, it appears that no part of Part 61 was not amended by that proposal. The deadline for comment was December 11, 1995, and the FAA eventually received over 5,400 comments, which were mostly letters from pilots. The FAA reported that most people had specific suggestions for the new rule, but 130 were generally supporting the new rule, and 220 were generally opposing any new rules. But of course, the process is not intended to be a vote. In the end, the FAA adopted the new rules on April 4, 1997, with a few changes, as evidenced by that Federal Register number I gave you, 62 FR 16298. And now it's in the Code of Federal Regulations, just as we discussed. Once again, if you have any questions about this topic, feel free to contact me. Thank you.